When my husband's children handed me an eviction notice on the day of his funeral, I didn't argue. I just smiled and started packing. They thought I'd break down crying. They thought I'd beg. Instead, I looked at Melissa and Trevor, standing there in their black funeral clothes with a manila folder full of legal papers, and I said, "Sure, take the house. It's all yours." They looked at each other like they'd won the lottery. Trevor actually laughed. Melissa said, "Finally, some sense from you." They had no idea what they were about to inherit. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how we got here. My name is Diane. I'm 61 years old. 3 years ago, I married a man named Walter Hastings, a retired contractor who built half the custom homes in our county over a 30-year career. He was 68 when we married, and I was his second wife. His first wife, Carol, had passed away from cancer 9 years before I ever met him. Walter had 2 children from that marriage. Melissa was 38 when I married her father. Trevor was 35. From the very first dinner I had with them, I could feel it. The cold stares, the tight smiles, the way Melissa would say things like, "So, Diane, how exactly did you two meet?" in a tone that made it sound like an interrogation. I met Walter at a grief support group. Actually, I had lost my first husband, Richard, to a heart attack 4 years earlier. Walter had lost Carol to cancer. We were both sitting in folding chairs in a church basement, surrounded by people who understood loss in a way most people don't. We started talking after the second meeting. By the 6th meeting, we were getting coffee together afterward. A year later, he proposed. I never once asked him for money. I never once asked him to change his will. I had my own house, actually, a small 3-bedroom I'd bought with Richard back in the 90s, and I sold it when Walter and I got married because he wanted us to build a life together in his house, the one he'd built with his own hands on 5 acres outside of town. That should have been my first warning sign, if I'm honest, selling my house, putting all my security into someone else's home. But I loved him. I trusted him. And for 2.5 years, we had a genuinely happy marriage. The problem was never Walter. The problem was his kids. Melissa worked as a regional manager for a chain of pharmacies. She had 2 kids of her own and a husband who never seemed to have a job that lasted more than a year. Trevor was a real estate agent, though from what I could tell, not a particularly successful one. He drove a leased BMW he couldn't really afford and talked constantly about the next big deal that was always just around the corner. Neither of them liked me. Not because I did anything wrong. I think deep down, they saw me as competition. Competition for their father's attention, for his money, and eventually for his estate. They were polite enough at first. Strained holiday dinners, awkward birthday parties. But as Walter's health started declining in our 2nd year of marriage, things got worse. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. It wasn't a death sentence right away, but it was serious. And it meant hospital visits, medication schedules, and a level of care that fell almost entirely on me. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do it for money. I did it because I loved him. I drove him to appointments. I learned to read his lab results better than some nurses. I sat with him during 3 different hospital stays, sleeping in those horrible reclining chairs because I didn't want him waking up alone. Melissa and Trevor visited maybe once a month, sometimes less. But here's the thing that started eating at them, I think. Watching me be the one there every single day. Watching their father lean on me, depend on me, love me. I believe, somewhere in the back of their minds, they started doing math. They started wondering what would happen to the house, the land, the savings, if their father died and I was still his wife. About 8 months before Walter passed, something shifted. Melissa started showing up more, bringing homemade meals. Asking Walter questions about just making sure everything's in order, Dad, for peace of mind. Trevor started talking about the house's value, casually dropping comments like, "Property around here has really gone up, huh, Dad?" I didn't think much of it at the time. I was exhausted. I was scared. My husband was dying in slow motion in front of me, and I was trying to hold both of us together. Walter passed away on a Tuesday morning in March. I was holding his hand. His last words to me were, "Thank you for staying." I didn't understand what he meant by that until much later. At the time, I thought he simply meant staying with him through the illness. I would come to learn it meant something much bigger. The funeral was 11 days later. Grief does strange things to time. I remember standing at the reception afterward, numb, shaking hands with people I barely knew, when Melissa approached me with that folder. "We need to talk about the house," she said, right there, at the reception, with people still eating little sandwiches around us. I told her this wasn't the time. She said it absolutely was the time, because, and I quote, "Dad's will named us as the primary beneficiaries of the estate, and legally, you have 30 days. I remember my whole body going cold. 30 days for what? I asked. "To vacate," Trevor said, stepping up beside his sister. "Look, Diane, we're not trying to be cruel here, but this house has been in our family since we were kids. It's not really fair for you to just stay in it. Not really fair." My husband had been dead for 11 days, and his son was lecturing me about fairness. I asked to see the will. Melissa said their family lawyer would be in touch. I went home that night, alone, in the house Walter and I had shared, and I sat on the floor of our bedroom and cried until I had nothing left. The next morning, I called a lawyer of my own. Her name was Renata Cole, and she came highly recommended by someone at my old church. I told her everything. The marriage, the illness, the sudden aggressiveness from Melissa and Trevor, the 30-day notice. Renata asked me one very important question. She asked, "Diane, were you named on the deed to the house?" And here's where things got complicated, because I honestly didn't know. Walter had handled all of that. I trusted him completely, and frankly, in the fog of caretaking and grief, I had never sat down and asked to see the paperwork myself. Renata pulled the county records. The house was solely in Walter's name, not jointly owned, which meant it would pass according to his will, and if his will named his children as primary beneficiaries, they had a real legal claim. I felt the floor drop out from under me all over again. But Renata, God bless her, wasn't ready to give up. She asked to see a copy of the will itself. And when it arrived from the estate attorney a few days later, something interesting emerged. The will had been updated. Not the original will Walter wrote years ago when his first wife was still alive, but a more recent one, dated just 14 months before he passed. In this updated will, Walter had in fact left the house and the majority of his estate to Melissa and Trevor. But there was a clause, a specific clause about outstanding debts and liabilities being settled before distribution, standard legal language that most people skim right over. Renata read that clause about 6 times. She got very quiet. Then she asked me something strange. She asked if Walter had ever mentioned taking out any loans against the house in the last 2 years of his life. I told her I didn't think so. But then I remembered something. About 18 months before he passed, right around the time his health started really declining, Walter had spent almost 2 full days in his home office with the door closed, on the phone, going through paperwork. When I asked him about it, he just said he was handling some business and not to worry about it. I hadn't thought about that moment in months, but suddenly it felt important. Renata told me to sit tight and let her do some digging. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "Diane, sometimes the people trying to take everything from you don't actually know what they're inheriting." 3 weeks passed. Melissa and Trevor grew impatient. They started calling more aggressively. Trevor showed up at the house unannounced twice, walking around the property like he already owned it, taking photos on his phone, probably for a real estate listing he was already dreaming up. Then came the moment in the driveway. It was a Saturday afternoon. Both of them arrived together, along with a locksmith they'd apparently hired themselves, completely overstepping any legal boundary, though I didn't know that yet. Melissa said the 30 days were up. She said it was time for me to hand over the keys and vacate the premises, or they would, quote, have to get authorities involved. This was the moment. This was when I could have fought. Renata had told me just 2 days before that she believed we had grounds to contest the will, or at the very least delay any eviction for months, possibly longer, while the estate went through proper probate. She said I had options. But I had also learned something new, something Renata had uncovered just 48 hours earlier, something Melissa and Trevor had absolutely no idea about. So instead of fighting, I smiled at both of them, standing there in my own driveway, and I said the words that changed everything. Sure, take the house. It's all yours. Trevor actually laughed out loud. He looked at his sister and said, "See, I told you she'd cave once we got serious." Melissa looked almost disappointed that I wasn't putting up more of a fight, like some small part of her had wanted the satisfaction of winning an actual battle. But she recovered quickly, snatched the keys right out of my hand, and told me I had until the end of the day to remove my personal belongings. I packed 2 suitcases. I took my clothes, some photographs, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and Richard's old watch, which I had kept all these years for sentimental reasons. Everything else I left behind, the furniture, the dishes, all of it. Melissa actually seemed surprised I didn't argue about the furniture. She said, almost suspiciously, "You're really not going to fight for anything?" I told her I just wanted peace. I told her grief had taken everything out of me, and I didn't have the energy for a legal battle. Every word of that was technically true. I was exhausted. I was grieving. But I also knew something they didn't. I drove away from that house with tears streaming down my face, and I want to be honest with you, some of those tears were real grief, real heartbreak over losing the home Walter and I had shared. But some of them, I'll admit now, were something closer to anticipation. I moved into a small rental apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, at least temporarily. Renata called me the following Monday and asked how I was holding up. I told her I was managing. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Do you want me to tell you what I found, or do you want to wait and let it play out?" I told her to let it play out. I wanted to see their faces. Here's what Renata had discovered, and what I now understood far better than Melissa or Trevor ever could. Remember those 2 days Walter spent in his office 18 months before he died? He hadn't been handling routine business. He had taken out a home equity loan against the property, a substantial one, $400,000. At first, this confused Renata just as much as it confused me, because that money had to go somewhere, and none of it showed up in our joint checking account or any account I had access to. It took real digging, phone calls to 3 different banks, a subpoena for records through the estate proceedings before the full picture came together. Walter had used that $400,000 to pay off enormous medical debts I never even knew he had. Turns out, before his heart condition, years before I even met him, Walter had privately funded an experimental treatment for Carol, his first wife, during her cancer battle. Insurance had refused to cover it. He had taken out loans, used credit, mortgaged pieces of property he owned at the time, all trying to save her life. It hadn't worked. She passed away anyway. And Walter had spent years quietly working to pay off those old debts, debts Melissa and Trevor never knew existed. Because Walter, in his pride, never told his own children how financially devastated Carol's illness had left him. When Walter met me, some of those old debts had finally been cleared, but new ones, related to his own heart condition, kept accumulating. Hospital stays aren't cheap, even with decent insurance. Specialists, medications, a procedure that wasn't fully covered. Walter, being the proud, private man he was, never told me the full extent of it either. He didn't want me worrying. He didn't want me feeling burdened. So 18 months before he died, he took out that home equity loan, $400,000. He used it to pay off the outstanding medical debt and to set aside a private fund, separate from the estate, separate from anything Melissa and Trevor could touch through the will. And here is the part that made Renata actually gasp out loud when she found it. Walter had put that private fund, that separate account, entirely in my name. Not the house. Not directly, anyway. The house, on paper, in the will, went to his children, just as it always had, because Walter didn't want a fight between his kids and his new wife over the property he'd built with his own hands. He thought giving them the house would keep the peace. But the loan he took against that house, the $400,000, remained an active lien on the property. And because of how he'd structured his estate planning, very deliberately, very quietly, with Renata's own law firm actually being the one who originally drew up these documents before I even had Renata as my own lawyer. That lien did not disappear when Walter died. It transferred with the property, which meant whoever inherited the house also inherited a $400,000 debt attached to it. Melissa and Trevor had been so eager, so aggressive, so certain they were claiming a valuable piece of real estate free and clear that neither of them had bothered to do a full title search before kicking me out. They saw house in the will, and their eyes turned to dollar signs. They never once asked why their father, a careful, methodical contractor who built homes for a living, would leave them a property without mentioning any liabilities attached to it. 3 days after I handed over the keys, Melissa called me screaming. I let it go to voicemail the first time. When she called again, I picked up. She was hysterical. She said the bank had sent notices. She said there was some kind of lien, some kind of mistake, $400,000, and did I know anything about it? I kept my voice calm. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about, which, again, was technically true in that moment, because officially, legally, I hadn't been informed of anything by the bank. I simply already knew, thanks to Renata's digging weeks before. Trevor showed up at my apartment 2 days later, banging on my door, red in the face, demanding answers. He said the house was basically worthless now, that the equity was gone, that the bank was threatening foreclosure if the loan wasn't addressed, and he wanted to know if I had done something, hidden something, sabotaged them somehow. I told him, very calmly, that I had left the house exactly as it was. I hadn't taken out any loans. I hadn't touched any paperwork. Everything he was dealing with had been set in motion by his own father, 18 months before he passed, and if he had questions about it, he should probably talk to the bank, or better yet, an estate attorney. Because I certainly wasn't obligated to explain his father's private financial decisions to him. He stood on my doorstep for a long moment, just staring at me. I think that was the first moment it really hit him. That maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated me. Over the following weeks, the full picture unraveled for them. The house, worth roughly $620,000 on paper, now had $400,000 of debt attached to it, plus accrued interest, plus the outstanding property taxes Walter had let slip during his final year of declining health, which added another $11,000 to the pile. Melissa and Trevor had two choices: sell the house immediately to pay off the lien and walk away with a small fraction of what they thought they were inheriting, or try to refinance the debt themselves and keep making payments on a house neither of them could actually afford to maintain on top of their own mortgages and expenses. They chose to sell. Of course they did. Neither of them had that kind of financial cushion. Trevor's real estate income was inconsistent at best, and Melissa's husband had just lost yet another job. The house sold 4 months later for $605,000. After paying off the lien, the accrued interest, back taxes, and closing costs, Melissa and Trevor split what remained. It came out to a little under $90,000 each. $90,000 for a house that had been in their family for decades. A house their father built with his own hands. gone, and split into a number that, after taxes, barely covered a year of expenses for either of them. Meanwhile, that private fund Walter had quietly set up in my name, the money left over after his medical debts were cleared, remained completely untouched by any of this. It wasn't a fortune, not by any means, but it was enough. Enough for me to put a down payment on a small, comfortable condo. Enough to live without financial fear for the first time since Richard passed away all those years ago. Enough to breathe. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know some people listening to this might think I'm gloating, or that this story is really about money, about winning some kind of financial war against my stepchildren. It isn't. Not really. About 6 months after the house sold, Melissa called me. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. She was crying. Not angry tears this time, something different. She apologized. She told me she'd found some of her father's old letters while going through storage boxes, letters from the years right after Carol's death. Letters where Walter had written about his guilt, his desperation trying to save her, the debts he'd buried himself in trying to give his first wife a fighting chance. Melissa told me she never knew any of it. She said her father had always seemed so steady, so capable, that she never imagined he'd been quietly drowning in debt and grief for years, all while raising 2 kids and trying to hold everything together. She told me she understood now why he trusted me the way he did in his final years. Not because I was after his money, but because I showed up when things were hard, the same way he had shown up for Carol, in his own complicated, imperfect way. I won't pretend Melissa and I are close now. We're not. But we talk sometimes. She sent me a photo of her kids last Christmas. Small steps. Trevor and I have not spoken since the day he showed up screaming on my doorstep. I don't know if we ever will. Some bridges, once burned that badly, just stay burned. And I've made peace with that. I think about Walter often. I think about his last words to me. Thank you for staying. I understand now that he wasn't just talking about the illness. He was talking about all of it. Staying through the hard conversations, staying through his children's coldness, staying, even when it would have been easier to walk away. He protected me the only way he knew how, quietly, carefully, without dramatic confrontations or difficult conversations with his kids that he probably didn't have the heart or the energy to have while he was dying. He built one final thing with his own hands, in a sense. Not a house this time, a safety net. And he made sure it was mine, and mine alone, long before anyone else even knew to look for it. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I've had a lot of time to think about what that lesson actually is, I think it's this. People will often show you exactly who they are the moment they believe there's something to gain. Grief has a way of stripping away the polite masks people wear, and what's underneath isn't always pretty. But I also learned that real love, the quiet, steady, unglamorous kind, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. Walter never once told me what he was doing for me financially. He never made me feel indebted to him or reminded me of his sacrifices. He simply loved me in the way he knew how, and trusted that the truth would reveal itself when it needed to. I also learned something about myself in all of this. I learned that dignity is worth more than a fight sometimes. I could have hired Renata to drag out a bitter legal battle with my stepchildren over that house. I could have spent a year, maybe longer, in courtrooms arguing over square footage and property lines with 2 people who had already made it clear how little respect they had for me. Instead, I chose peace. I chose to let them walk into a situation with their eyes wide shut, confident and greedy, while I quietly stepped back and let the truth do the work I didn't have the energy to do myself. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop fighting people who were never going to see reason anyway, and simply let time and truth and consequences handle what you no longer have the strength to carry. I'm 61 years old now. I live in a small condo with a garden view and 2 cats who keep me plenty of company. I still think about Walter every single day, especially in the mornings when the light comes through my kitchen window the same way it used to come through the kitchen in that old house. I don't hate Melissa and Trevor. I feel something closer to sadness for them, honestly. Sadness that their grief turned so quickly into greed. Sadness that they lost not just a house, but years of relationship with me. Years they could have spent getting to know the woman their father loved in his final chapter, instead of treating me like an obstacle standing between them and an inheritance. But I've also forgiven them, in my own way. Grief makes people do strange, sometimes ugly things. I know that better than anyone. I just hope, someday, they find their own version of peace, the same way I eventually found mine. If you've ever been underestimated by people who thought they knew your whole story, people who thought they had you figured out, I hope this reminds you of something important. You don't always have to prove them wrong loudly. Sometimes the quietest, most graceful exit is the loudest statement you'll ever make. And sometimes the people trying hardest to take everything from you have no idea what they're actually inheriting.